In this tutorial, you will learn about the for statement. The for statement is a type of repetition statement which allows us to execute a statement multiple times. You will learn the syntax for a for statement, and you will learn the for statement is a preferred loop when you know in advance how many times the statement will be repeated. This is the syntax to create a for loop. For is the reserved word, followed by an open parenthesis and closed parenthesis. Inside the parenthesis are three statements. The first initializes a variable to act as the counter. The second is a condition which evaluates to true or false, and the third is an increment statement to change the value of the counter. The semicolons within the parenthesis are required. You must have them. You will see instances later on where the initialization statement and the increment statement will not be within the open-close parenthesis, but the semicolons will still be there. You will separate the initialization and condition statements with a semicolon, and then the condition and increment statements with a semicolon. Use a block statement to execute more than one statement during each iteration of the loop. Do not include a semicolon after the closed parenthesis of a for statement. All for loops can also be written as while statements. In this example, a counter I is created and initialized to 0. The loop will execute while I is less than 4, and after each iteration I will be incremented by 1. You can calculate the number of times the statements in the loop will execute by looking at these values. Since I is being incremented by 1 after each iteration, the loop will execute when I is 0, 1, 2, and 3, or 4 times total. As soon as I is incremented to 4, the condition will evaluate to false and the loop will end. Let's trace this loop to see the flow of control. I will create a counter I and initialize it to the value 0. After initialization, I will be tested. Is I less than 4? True. So flow of control hops into the loop. The contents of I will be printed, followed by a space. After all the statements in the for loop have been executed, flow of control returns up to the increment statement. I is incremented by 1, and then flow of control returns to the condition. Is 1 less than 4? True. We hop into the loop, print the contents of I in a space, and return up to the incrementer. I is incremented by 1. Is 2 less than 4? True. We hop into the loop and print out the contents of I in a space. We return back to the incrementer, and I is incremented by 1. We test to see, is 3 less than 4? True. Hop into the loop, print the contents of I, and return to the incrementer. Notice we never return to the initialization statement. I is incremented by 1, and we test, is 4 less than 4? False. We do not hop into the loop. Instead, flow of control returns to the first statement outside of the for loop. If this statement was executed and we tried to print the contents of I, a compiler error would occur. Like all block statements, variables created within a for statement do not exist after the for loop terminates. All for loops can be written as a while loop. I can rewrite this for loop like this. My initialization statement to create the counter I will occur before the while loop. I'll loop while the contents of I are less than 4, print out the contents of I, and then increment I. So let's look at another example. A common question on upcoming tests and on the AP exam is how many times will the statements in this for loop execute? And to calculate that number, you're going to look at the counter variable, the condition, and then the incrementer. We can see that our counter starts at 5, and we will go into the loop as long as I is greater than or equal to 0. Every time we execute the loop, we'll subtract 1 from our counter. So we are going to loop when I is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0 because we're looping while it's equal to 0. So that will be 6 different times. So our output will be 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. In this example, our counter will start at 0 and we're going to loop while the counter is less than or equal to 10. But each time we go up to the incrementer, we're going to add 2. So initially I will contain 0 and then 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. When I is 10, we will still hop into the loop because our condition is when I is less than or equal to 10. So our output will be 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. The loop will execute this statement 6 times. Another common question is to write nested for loops for a given pattern. And to do this, you will have an outer for loop and inner for loops. So the first thing you're going to do is define the pattern. There are 4 lines being printed. So our outer loop will loop 4 times. We're going to start at 0 and we'll loop while our counter is less than 4. So 0, 1, 2, or 3. That will be 4 times. On the first line, we are going to print 3 dashes, a star, and then 3 dashes. On the second line, we'll print 2 dashes, 3 stars, and 2 dashes. And then 1 dash, 5 star, 1 dash, and then 0 dash, 7 star, 0 dash. So every time we change characters, that will be a different loop. So let's look at the dashes. We're first going to print 3 dashes, then 2 dashes, then 1 dash, then 0 dash. So if we create a new counter I and initialize it to whatever n is, then we can loop from that point up until, but not including 3. So the first time in the loop, n is 0. So that will print 0, 1, or 2, which will give us 3 dashes. At the end of the line, the pattern is the same, so we'll duplicate our loop at the end. Well, now let's look at the pattern for creating the stars. To do that, I've created a chart. So when our outer loop n is 0, I'm going to print 1 star. The next time we go through the loop, n will be 1, and I'll print 3 stars. And then when n is 2, I'll print 5 stars, and then when n is 3, I'll print 7 stars. So let's see if we can come up with an algorithm to calculate the number of stars based on what n is. Well, how about n times 2 plus 1? So when n is 0, this expression will evaluate to 1. When n is 1, this expression will evaluate to 3. When n is 2, this expression will evaluate to 5. And when n is 3, this expression will evaluate to 7. So that is the algorithm to print the number of stars. So I can express that expression in the condition part of our for loop. I'll start out with 0 and I'll loop while I is less than n times 2 plus 1. So when n is 0, I'll print out 1 star and so forth, so on. Notice that I'm using the same counter variable I 3 times within my outer for loop. This works because when the first for loop ends, I no longer exists. So I can recreate I for the second loop and then for the third loop. Also notice that I'm using a print statement so that my cursor doesn't return to the next line. After I'm done printing the entire line, I'll issue a println statement to go to the next line. You may want to stop the video at this point and copy this algorithm down and type it up in BlueJ and see how you can change it. In this tutorial, you learned that the for statement is a type of repetition statement which allows us to execute a statement multiple times. You learned the syntax for creating a for statement, and you learned that the for statement is the preferred loop when you know in advance how many times the statement will be repeated.